Okay, I kick off. Thanks for the introduction, Richard. And as I say, good to be here with you tonight. To impart some of the knowledge I've gained over the years. I started beekeeping when I was 7 or 8 years of age. Initially, my father taught me beekeeping, but I suppose over the years I've probably learned more from the bees than I have from any human teacher. And by listening to what the bees tell you, I think that's the best way for us to learn what we're doing right, what we're doing well, and to correct when we're doing things wrong. So we work with native bees, with AMM. They're adapted to our local area, and we try not to bring in anything other than what works in our particular location. And this is the way we manage our colonies. It may not be the way everyone can manage them, but it's the way we do it, and it works very well for us. So we'll kick off with the talk. So we're talking about maximizing production. So let's establish first of all what I actually produce. So obviously I produce honey. It's run honey mainly that we do. We do a small amount of comb honey, more for family and for a few selected people that come looking for it. There's a lot of extra work in it. We have a lot of oilseed rape in our locality in the surrounding areas of our apiary, so we tend not to get a good spot for doing comb honey except on the heather, but we produce a bit of that, okay? We produce queens, AMM queens. We produce bees, and by that I mean we're producing AMM drones to support our queen rearing operation, and we're also producing thousands of worker bees that we use for our honey production and also to support our queen rearing, and I'll explain that in a while. Okay, we also produce nucleus colonies, quite a number of those, and some of those we sell in the spring. Overwintered nuclei sell very well for us in the spring. Some of them, most of them, in fact, we use to support our production. Our honey production and our queen rearing operation are supported by the nuclei. So my management principles are: keep strong, healthy hives with native bees that are adapted to local condition. So it's the weather really that's determining whether I get a crop of bees or honey each year, rather than the quality of the bees themselves, because they're all native, they're adapted, and they'll work best in my locality when the weather is right for them. I try to maximize the production by maximizing the population. Strong colonies, very, very strong colonies. I change out brood combs regularly. About half of the brood combs over all my hives are changed out every year. Every time I raise queens, I'm looking for some improvement in the quality of the bees and in the amount of the crop that I'm getting from those colonies with the next generation. So I believe that without improving, when you're raising queens, unless you improve with every generation, you're wasting time, because you're getting this otherwise you're getting whatever problem you have with your bees at the moment, you're just duplicating that and putting that same problem into more hives. So every time we look for some sort of an improvement. And if it's not there, we go back, we take that queen out of production then the following year and replace it with another one. The way we do our improvement is using detailed notes. Every time we do an inspection, we put in our notes and we criticize the bees. We go through our scoring system to see how the bees are performing against the other bees in the apiary on the particular day. And at the end of the year, when we go over our notes, we're able to identify the best performers and the worst performers, and we compare within the apiary. So that in an apiary, every colony has the same climate, has the same pressures, has the same resources available in regards to pollen and nectar that they can collect. So by looking at the ones that outperform their neighbours within the same apiary, they're the top performers. The ones that are at the bottom of the averages, they're the ones that we're going to cull out. And by cull, I don't mean kill. We don't kill queens as a rule. We just don't allow them to raise any daughter queens or allow them to raise any drones. So we only raise our drones and our queens from our best colonies. And of course, we have to keep the colonies from swarming. We have a huge population in our hives and we've got to stop them swarming. And our management method feeds into reducing the tendency to swarm. So our AMM bees, They've evolved and adapted, as you know, to our climate and to the forage that's available for them. They have a reputation for more compact brood nest, or they overwinter with less stores. They're frugal, which is a beekeeper's way of saying that they're a bit mean or they're tight. They work at lower temperatures, both to forage and with regard to queens mating and drones going out to congregation areas. That'll happen at lower temperatures with the native than it will with the hybrids or the imported bees. And they have a reputation for a gradual population build up in spring. Now, I question that. That's not what we experience. We do not experience our colonies building up slowly in spring. Right? Given the opportunity and the resources, they will build up very rapidly in spring, and we select that. That's one of the selection criteria we use when we're queen rearing. So we select the best performers over the other criteria, and as well as that, the ones that perform in spring with nest build-up. Okay, so my objective is to get the bees to rear as much extra brood as possible. Have them working like brood factories, if you like, right? Lots and lots of extra brood. More brood means more bees is more production. But again, we must stop swarming, or must try to prevent swarming. Okay, so this is the way I work. I work with national hives. I did have a mixture of national and commercial, but for convenience, I'm all down to national hives now. I have supporting nuclei for those colonies, probably between a third and a half again in numbers for the supporting nuclei. I'm running 90 production colonies at the minute, so I would have something between 30 and 50 nuclei supporting them next season. Okay, all of my production hives have 2 national deep brood boxes. That's 24 national deep frames. But I have a queen excluder between the 2 boxes. The queen never gets out of the bottom box. She's always in the lower box, but up to half of her brood will be above the excluder. Okay, so effectively she's got 24 frames that she can raise brood, or she can lay for brood. Okay, and here's how we manage it. When the lower box, in the springtime, when the lower box has 7 or 8 frames with brood on it, we pick 1 or 2, when we're doing a weekly inspection, we pick 1 or 2 frames of advanced brood and we move them into the middle of the upper box. Now this is brood that's already sealed, so the only maintenance required on that is really to keep it warm until it hatches out in 12, 13 days time, up to 13 days time. Okay, and we put those couple of frames of advanced brood above the queen excluder in the upper box between 2 frames of stores. And this is where our frames of ivy stores that we take out in the spring come back into play. Those 2 frames of stores, honey, as you know, is a poor conductor of heat. So those 2 frames of stores will hold the heat, the warmth in around those 2 frames of brood in the upper box, meaning it's easier for the bees to keep it warm until it hatches. Okay, so we're looking at a frame of advanced brood like that, 3/4 of the frame with brood cover. Okay, so the brood frames that we took up from downstairs, we move all the brood back together and we put frames of drawn comb on the outside of the brood nest downstairs. So we're not splitting the brood nest at any stage. We don't put empty frames at any stage into the middle of the brood nest where the queen is laying. Always to the outside. Never split it. We don't need to because we have a second box up above. Okay, where do we get those frames of drawn comb? We use deep boxes for supers. First super on every hive is going to be a deep box, like another brood box if you like. And when we extract the honey from those combs then become brood combs, clean, new wax brood combs the following season. So there's never any shortage of them for us. Okay, so in subsequent weeks, following week and the week after, we examine the lower brood box first. Lift off the upper boxes, put the queen excluder on top of them, and work the bottom box. Okay, we do our usual weekly inspection, looking for queen cells, looking for how they're developing and determining what condition that colony is going to be in a week's time. So we're predictive rather than reactive in our beekeeping. When we work our colony, we're saying, what's that colony going to be like in 7 days' time? And what do we need to do this week in order that they're not going to be under pressure in 7 days' time? rather than going in and suddenly discovering queen cells. Now what do? Panic, of course, and then we figure out what we're going to do. Instead of that, we're looking, are they going to be throwing up queen cells in a week's time? Are they stuck for space? Do they have something that would encourage them to raise queen cells in a week's time? If we think that's going to happen, we try to solve that problem so it doesn't become a problem. So we do our usual weekly inspection, examining 12 frames, and we do go through every brood box, every frame, every week, between two of us. Takes most of Saturday and about half a Sunday to get that done each week. 90 hives, 90 brood chambers, all examined every week. None of this split the box, look for queen cells. If you don't see them on the top or the bottom, they're okay. We don't do that. We go through every frame, and it can be done. Okay. Again, if we have 7 or 8 frames of advanced brood or brood downstairs, we rob a couple of frames and put them back up into the middle upstairs, into the dead center, splitting the ones that are up there this time. So the newer frames are always in the middle of the upper box. Okay. And again, we bring the brood nest together downstairs and put more drawn comb out to the outside. What's happening here is that the older combs are being brought upstairs gradually as they're getting filled, and we're putting new virgin comb in downstairs into that brood nest. That comes in to our plan later on when we're taking off older combs and we're replacing them. They all happen to be above the queen excluder later on in the year because we've brought them up. Okay. We put back, after we've examined the box downstairs, we put back on the queen excluder and the second brood box goes back up on top. Now at this stage, at most, we will have to manage upstairs. We'll have to inspect 2 frames, whatever we brought up last week, and they'll be the ones in the center. And we're checking them for queen cells. We're checking them for any problem with the brood that's up there. Should there have been a little bit of open brood left or something like that upstairs. So we're only examining an extra 2 frames, but potentially that queen has 24 frames of brood area. But we're only looking at a maximum of 14 frames in any week. So it's not double the work. We close up the colony and we update our notes on one of the things we do is we count the number of frames each week that the brood nest covers. So how many frames actually have brood on them in any stage, whether it's eggs, larvae, newly sealed, advanced, hatching, that there's brood still in it. We count the number of frames in that, and we do that on every inspection. And when we're doing our analysis of the colonies at the end of the year, when we go back over the colonies, we're able to see which ones of them moved from 4 frames to 5 frames to 6 frames to 8 frames to 10 frames to 12 frames versus the ones that went from 4 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 6 to 7 to 8. So you can see which ones gradually build up and which ones build up rapidly when they have the resource there. And that identifies the ones we want to put into our queen rearing program and our drone rearing program in order to give us the rapid population build up that we need for our operation. So having done that, each week we repeat that every time that they hit the 7 or 8 frames of brood downstairs, and we keep giving them more combs downstairs for the queen to lay in and bring the brood upstairs. By the middle of June, typically, we would be on 16 to 18 frames with brood on them. After we get to maybe about the 3rd or 4th week of doing this, we could be bringing up 3 frames or maybe 4 frames from downstairs to the upper box, depending on how quickly they're building up. Now, any of the brood frames that we've brought up from downstairs that are still light brown in color, they're not black, that they've been, they've done several generations of brood through them. The lighter colored ones we can recycle back downstairs. The darker ones stay above the queen excluder. So frames that are like that have hatched out, that's one that's just hatched out, has been brought back downstairs and is laid in. You can see some eggs in the middle of it there. A frame like that would go back downstairs to let the queen lay in it again. But if it's black, old black or very dark brown comb, we'd leave that above the queen excluder. Okay, so the older dark brood comb stays upstairs, newer combs are going downstairs. When we've repeated that 4 times, so about a month into our inspection, so towards the end of May, we usually start our proper colony inspections around the 3rd week in April. That's when the dandelion comes out, is about the time we start doing our proper inspections. So about by the end of May, we'll probably have about 8 brood combs in the upper box. And a lot of those are going to be dark, old combs that they've had since last year. We leave them in the upper box to hatch out. We don't put them back down. They'll get back filled with honey during the season. And we'll take them off, remove them, extract them. We cut out the old comb and we, using a steamer, we render down the wax from those. Right. There's a couple of blocks of wax that we did in May last year, May Bank Holiday weekend last year. We had 15 kilos or about 27 pounds of wax rendered from old brood combs at that stage that we'd taken off the previous autumn. We get 8 sheets to the pound. That's 216 sheets of wired National Deep Foundation on a straight exchange basis. Last year, that would have cost me €380.16 to purchase those 216 sheets of National Deep Foundation. I haven't paid for foundation for about 7 years. It's my foundation gets its exchange for blocks of wax. All right. So it's another income you can make from your bees. So what are the pros of this system? That's basically the system that I use. It's as simple as that. We have an awful lot of deep boxes. As I said, we use them for second brood boxes and we use them for supers as well. So the pros of it are you have a bigger population, up to 16 to 18 frames of brood. So you have a much bigger increase in production because you have the workforce there to do it. And that's production across all of those areas that I mentioned earlier on. Run honey, comb honey, queens, drones, worker bees, across all of that. We're only examining an extra 2 brood frames every week. We're renewing up to half of our brood combs, our old dark brood combs, every year. So that's getting rid of a storage of pathogens that are there waiting to be released onto the bees. So it's putting them under less pressure. Queen always has plenty of space to lay. And that's key for our swarm control, right? She's never stuck for brood space, right? And with those extra boxes sitting up on top, they're not stuck for space to store bees in overnight. Bear in mind that when you're working your colony during the middle of a summer's day, 50% of the population is not in the colony. They're out foraging, up to half. That's from Randy Oliver, Ralph Bushler, and all the researchers will tell you that half of the bees aren't in the hive when you're examining them on the ideal day, a warm, middle of the day, warm summer's day. Half the bees aren't there. So where did that other half of the colony go at night? They need plenty of space, and we make sure they always have it. The queen is confined to the lower box, right? And there's less chance of her getting crushed as you're lifting on and off boxes, as would happen with brood and a half. I don't do brood and a half. I don't see any reason why it's needed. If they can work a brood and a half, they can work a double brood. And yeah, it makes more sense to me to stick with the same size frame so you can move them up and down as needed. All right. So the extra laying space and new comb building, phenomenal reduction in swarming. The young bees, the newly hatched bees, when they've done their initial brood rearing duties, they'll move on then, the wax glands develop and they need wax to draw, they need comb to build. And we're giving it to them by giving them new combs downstairs, drawn comb and some foundation on the outside of the brood nest. We're giving them a place to use that wax from their glands that are developing. So it greatly reduces that. My queens, because they're not swarming that much, usually when they get into their third full season, by the end of that, in July, August, into September, they're superseding at that stage rather than swarming because they didn't have a real reason to swarm up to then, because none of the usual pressures like restriction, overcrowded brood nest, restriction in area to store honey, not enough space for the queen to lay, those are gone. So they don't really have an excuse to swarm unless there are swarmy genetics in them there somewhere, and we've already eliminated those sorry, due to our queen rearing selection. So we don't get that much swarming, but we do get a lot of supersedure, and we select for it because it's easier for us to manage our colonies if they look after reproduction at colony level by supersedure. So usually the supersedure will happen in the latter part of the year. August, September would be typical for us. And that'll happen when the bees are working the heather. We'll have them on the heather at that stage. It'll usually be a bit cooler where we have them. And at that stage, it's the non-native drones that are going to be out in the drone congregation area, not the hybrids and not the recent imports. So we've less chance of getting hybridization because our ones are the ones that are flying at 12, 13, 14 degrees, not looking for 17 degrees before they'll head out to the disco to see if there's a queen passing by, you know. So it greatly reduces hybridization for us as well. So what are the cons? If you have pros, you're supposed to have cons. Well, the humorous side of it is cons is a collection of people called Connor, Constance, or Cornelius. Or if you're from across the water, it's a term for prisoners, right? So I don't consider them cons. I consider them excuses for not doing it, right? I think my system is fantastic. So there can't be anything wrong with it. You just have excuses why you don't want to do it. So what are the excuses, right? I'd need additional brood boxes and deep frames that I don't have, right? Well, that's an excuse because you should have them. You should always have spare equipment. I reckon somewhere between a quarter of the equipment that you have out in the apiaries, you should have in reserve as well. So whatever number of supers you have out there, whatever number of brood boxes you have out there, you should have about a quarter as much, again, waiting to go back out as needed. All right. It's better to have it sitting idle in the shed than being looking for it when you don't have it, right? The second brood box is too heavy when it's backfilled with honey. That's some excuse, isn't it? Beekeepers should never complain that the honey is too heavy. All right. Get a second person to lift it with you. You should be bragging about the fact that you're taking off boxes that have 45 to 50 pounds of honey in them instead of complaining about it, right? Those deep frames, when they're full of honey, they don't fit in my extractor because I have a radial extractor, let's say, right? Well, if you go to your local engineering works, 30 or 50 quid will get them to make up 3 or 4 cages like that. Stainless steel. Not even the apprentice will do those up. You don't need a master engineer to make them up. Position them in your radial extractor, and away you go. And you can extract your frames. And it's not such a big deal to turn the frames 2 or 3 times to get them dried out. When you're looking at a national deep box bringing you in 45 to 50 pounds of honey, that's definitely worth the while spending a few quid to get these done. All right, you have less boxes to take off, less frames to be handled as well in the long run. So deep frames they're workable. You can do it. Now let's jump on to the queen rearing side of things. What are we going to do with all that big population? Because it's not just the honey production. I mentioned we were producing queens and drones and workers as well. So on the queen rearing side of things, that exact same method, we use it. They're like brood factories. I robbed that name from Mike Palmer over in Vermont. He calls them brood factories, and effectively that's what they are. You have colonies, support colonies that are producing brood for our queen rearing operation and also for our honey production operation, which I'll come to in a little while. So we set up hives particularly for producing brood to support our queen rearing. When we have frames of ready to emerge workers, when we bring up a frame of seal brood to the upper box, that's going to be up there for 13 days until it hatches out, 12 to 13 days. So we will take those frames out a week later and we can move them into a colony that's set up as a starter finisher. They're going to hatch within 4 or 5 days of that. And every one of those frames is going to put about 4,000 extra newly hatched bees into our starter finisher. And that's what you want. You want bees that are just after hatching out, right? That are hatched out a couple of days ago, and they're at the stage where they're going to start feeding the larvae you're putting in there to raise queens. So you want a huge population of newly hatched bees in your starter finisher, and this is where we get them. We rob them out of colonies where we've brought up a frame of worker brood a week prior to setting up our starter finisher. Okay. We also use frames of ready to emerge workers for making up nuclei. All right. If we have a colony that is getting ready to swarm, we'll take the queen out. We work with 6 frame nukes. We'll make up a nuke with her. We'll bring a frame of brood with that queen on it into the new box. A couple of shakes of bees in with it, enough bees to cover about 3 frames of brood. We put in a frame of brood from one of our brood factories, ready to emerge. It's going to emerge within a few days. We put in a frame of stores from ivy that we've taken out of our colonies in the early part of the spring to give the space in the brood nest. And we put in a couple of frames of drawn comb and a frame of foundation, right? So we're giving them, we're not robbing bees out of the colony that was getting ready to swarm to populate the nuke. Not a huge amount of them. We're only giving them enough to cover frames of ready to emerge brood, because the population in that is going to increase by about 8 to 10,000 within a few days when those frames hatch out. Right? Those brood factories are also a source of recently emerged workers to fill our apidays or our mating nukes. And again, we want the youngest possible. So we can let them hatch out in a colony, and then we can go to that colony and rob them off those deep brood frames, rather than the traditional thing would have been, we go to the supers. We're not likely to get queen up there. We're not likely to get drones up there, but we're taking away our honey processing bees out of our honey production colonies. So if you're raising queens and you're robbing your bees to fill your mating nukes out of your supers, you're sacrificing your honey crop. So we have hives that are specifically set up to give us those bees. They're bee factories, if you like, for our mating nukes and our anti-swarming nukes. Okay, so queen rearing doesn't reduce the honey production, because we've specific colonies for honey production, and we've other colonies as supports then for the honey production and for the queen rearing. So some colonies are support, and we get nothing off them except bees, but it is production. Like, we do get a harvest off them, but they're bees. Okay. Again, for queen rearing, if a double brood box, full size, is too much, you're not able to lift them, whatever it's going to be, right? You don't have to use full size colonies. You can use nuclei for your double brood instead. Okay, so you have your 5 or 6 frame nuke, and that can be several stories high. Okay, so you put the queen into a nuke, your selected queen for raising your daughter queens, and you put her into a nuke with 2 deep boxes on her. No queen excluder, right? It's warmer in the upper box. You can have more than 2 boxes, obviously. It's warmer in the upper box, so what happens is you get a kind of a chimney effect. It's warmer in the second story, and the queen will concentrate her brood rearing, because she's no restriction. She'll do it in the upper box. And every few weeks, you can swap the boxes around. When you go to your colonies, if they're on a double brood box over winter, when you go to them in the spring, invariably the queen is going to be in the upper box with the brood, because it's warmer than being down near the entrance or near an open mesh floor with a slide underneath it. So she'll be in the upper box because it's warmer. So the same effect is in the nukes when they're 2 or 3 or 4 tiers high, and every couple of weeks you swap them around, and then she's got an empty box in the upper part, and she goes up into that to raise more brood. Okay, we can harvest frames of ready to emerge brood from some of these nuclei. This is what I call my support nuclei. We harvest frames of ready to emerge brood from those, and we put them into the production colonies, and we put them into the queen rearing colonies, the support colonies for the queen rearing. Right? So we're putting in more bees than that colony would be producing on its own. And we replace those frames again with drawn comb. If we replace with foundation, we feed, because they'll need the feed to draw out the comb. And we repeat that every week or every 2 weeks. Now, the apiary I have here at the back of the house is the apiary I use for my queen rearing. And that was the layout of it last summer. Okay, so you see number of colonies there, multi-storied. Okay, so these are the support colonies for the queen rearing. Those are those nuclei. The 2 on the right-hand side of the picture are 6 frame nukes. The one on the left-hand side with the green, white, and white is a panes nuke where we've taken out the feeder. So there's 8 frames in each of those tiers. So that's 3 8s, 24 frames in there. And that would have about 18, 19 frames of brood in it. Because it's extra warm, because it's compressed polystyrene or whatever, and being multi-tiered, the chimney effect, they'll raise an awful lot more brood, right? And we feed them as necessary on that, right? So there are support colonies, and we would be robbing frames of brood out of these colonies here, ready to emerge brood, to put into our queen rearing colonies, or to put into our honey production colonies, or to make up nuclei, right? So they're providing frames of ready to emerge brood to replenish the starter finisher. That's our starter finisher here, that tall one there. We have a brood box down here with the queen. We have a shallow super in between. And this is the one that we'll be putting our cell bars into for queen rearing. And this is where we put in, the next box up then is where we put in our brood, the ready to emerge brood, to continually replenish that with a huge population of very young worker bees. Right, and we cycle that in, more frames in. Every time we take a batch of seal queen cells out, we're putting in a frame or 2 frames of ready to emerge worker brood to boost the population in that. Okay. And we can also harvest workers out of that for filling our apidays as needs. Okay. This is our home apiary, same apiary. In 2016, there was 10 acres of oilseed rape literally across the road from where the apiary is, here at the house. And there were our colonies that we had up there. They were honey production colonies. The foam in front on the ground there was because they were going to spray that crop with an aphicide, and they gave us the heads up the night before. We stuck the foam in them, and when the insecticide had dissipated, we just went along the front of them, whipped the foam out and dropped it on the ground in front. So that's what's going on there. So if you take a look at those, that's our typical setup. We have deep boxes on there for supers, some deeps, some shallows, depending on what was available at the time. And if you tot them up there, left-hand side, you have 48 national deep on that box. We have a weaker colony there with only 24 on it. So you see the quantities that are in there on it. That's our setup. Colossal population. Most people, when they read a beekeeping book, they'll say, oh, how many bees are in a hive? Oh, you could have 50, 60,000 in it in the summer. And some of them will brag and say you have 80,000 or 100,000 in it. We do have those populations in ours. A lot of beekeepers don't. If they hit 50,000, that's their max. That's kind of middle of the range for us in the early part of the summer. And it'll go up quite higher than that later on. Okay, that was in 2016. It was a particularly good year for us there. Last year, we brought these nuclei and a couple of hives to a crop of oilseed rape. That was on the 7th of April. We brought them out onto the oilseed rape. That's barley behind it now. That's not the oilseed rape. All right. 25 days later, we had most of those transferred into hives out of the nukes. It was easier for us to move the overwinter nukes because more of them fitted in the van and the trailer. And then when we got them there, we expanded them out into full-size boxes. And so one of those nukes that was 2 or 3 stories high is taking up a box and a half of national deeps. So 25 days later, that's the sizes of those. And those boxes aren't there for show. They were there because they were full of honey or full of nectar that was out there being brought in as was being converted to honey. That's what they were facing on the other side of the little river that's running in front of them. There was about 80 acres of oilseed rape in there. And that was 25 days after we brought them in. That was the difference in the size of those because the populations were there. All right. We've one little colony there in a Payne's nuke, this little guy there. That was a queen that was in her 4th year, and we were being nice to her. She wasn't going to produce a crop. We were keeping her ticking over there. And each week that we went there, we were robbing a frame of eggs from her to bring back to our queen rearing in the latter part of the season. We were just keeping her in a small box to stop her raising too much brood, to see if we get a full season out of her, where we could rob frames of eggs to transport home. When they hatched into larvae, we were then using them we were grafting out of those frames then to raise daughter queens. Now, let's go through the maths. It's all well and good, Colm telling you all of this, and you have to believe him because you took the time out to listen to him tonight, so you might have to believe him. So let's work on the maths on this, right? So the normal bees to brood ratio that's within a colony, and these figures aren't mine. I'm not a scientist by any means. These are coming from research by Tom Seeley, Randy Oliver, and many others. And they've got a ratio that the dynamics of a colony that has 50,000 bees in it at night time. Bear in mind, half them are out when you're working during the day. So a colony of 50,000 bees, this is the ratio that you've got within that. You have about 25,000 foragers. So half your population are foragers. out collecting your pollen, your water, your nectar, your propolis, right? You've about 25,000 house bees. So half and half, adult bees are foragers or they're house bees, right? There's about 6,000 eggs. That's about 3 days worth of eggs. If you take it, the queen is laying 1,500 to 2,000 eggs a day. So that's about 3 days worth of eggs. You have 9,000 uncapped larvae. So that's 9,000 between day 4 and end of day 8. I'll go back. And you have 20,000 capped brood. All right, so that's your ratio that's in there, right? Now, when we are using our support colonies, we're taking a frame of frame or 2 frames of ready to emerge brood, and we're putting it into that colony that has a balanced ratio of bees to eggs to larvae to brood, right? So if we add in 2 frames of advanced brood into that colony, what happens? All right, so let's do a little bit of real mathematics. Feet and inches. My bees never went metric, so we stick with inches. So a national deep frame, the sheet of exposed foundation that's in that is 13.5 by 8. There's 2 sides, so that's 216 square inches. There's 25 cells to the square inch of worker cells. So potentially you have 5,400 cells available to have brood in them for each frame, each national deep frame. Okay, so 2 of them gives us 10,800. And if we have about 3/4 cover with brood in that, ready to emerge or near emergence, that gives us about 8,000 extra worker bees that are going to hatch out within a few days when we bring in 2 frames of advanced brood. So that's really going to screw up the population dynamics in there. You have a balanced one in there, 25,000 adult foragers, 25,000 house bees, plus all of the brood. And now you're putting in an extra 1,000 potential, the extra 8,000 potential house bees are going to appear within a few days. So what does that do to the population inside? So the new ratio is going to be 25,000 foragers. That doesn't change. We've 33,000 house bees now. All right, the rest stays the same. So what happens to those extra house bees? There's no work there for them to do. Randy Oliver reckons about 1,500 bees are needed to look after a deep brood frame 3/4 filled with brood. Now, he's probably working with Langstrath, but whatever. You don't need all those extra bees because your number of frames of brood, of young brood, eggs and young brood hasn't increased at all. So what happens to them? What work do they get to do? So what happens to them is that they take up, the newly hatched bees take up the early life duty. So the older house bees get pushed away because there's younger bees there to look after those jobs, processing nectar, that kind of stuff, right? So the older house bees get pushed out and they become foragers. And their original tasks are now taken over by the younger bees that are in the colony. These are the ones we were after introducing with our extra couple of frames. So Ralph Bushler's research has shown that where young bees aren't looking after brood, they're not feeding brood, their hypopharyngeal glands aren't in use, those bees last an awful lot longer. We were taught, Hooper's book, 6 weeks, 3 weeks in the colony, 3 weeks foraging, and then apparently the wings wear out and they die, they fly, they don't come back. Ralph Bushler's thrown that on its head. If they're not rearing brood, he has them lasting 8 to 12 weeks, which is staggering. And they were putting different colours on bees, depending on what day they hatched, and putting them into a colony where the queen wasn't allowed to lay. She was trapped in a little cage up at the top of the frame. She was there, but she wasn't laying. And they were checking back every week to see how many of those coloured bees from a particular date were there in the evening time when the foraging was finished. And they found they were lasting 8 to 12 weeks, which, okay, if they're not rearing brood, they have a longer life. It doesn't take as much out of them. And that would match in with what we know about winter bees, right? They're not raising as much. Now there's difference in the fat bodies, but they've less work rearing brood, so they tend to live a bit longer. Okay, so our new ratio now is 33,000 foragers 25,000 house bees, and our eggs, larvae and cap brood stay the same. So a week later, we throw in another couple of frames of ready to emerge brood. And we've no shortage of these because we have a third to half as many support colonies as we have production colonies. So we're doing this every week. We're throwing in an extra frame or two into our production colonies, all right, and throwing on an extra super most weeks as well. So that's another 8,000 house bees. So when we tip this up a bit now, we still have the same number of house bees that are going to be there during the day, but we've 45,000 now, almost double what we had as foragers. So our crop increases. All right. They say the maths don't lie, but I don't know whether they do or not. This is what's happening for us, and it just works. So how can we use that population of young bees, right? So we're using them in that mathematics there. We're showing we're using them for foraging. We've got extra foragers, right? We can also use them to make up new colonies, full-size colonies, right? When a hive is getting ready to swarm, we can take the queen out. We can put her into a nuke, or we could put her into a full-size hive and throw in a few frames of young bees from one of these colonies that's been boosted, right? All the bees don't have to come from the same colony, right? We can use them also to boost starter-finisher colonies, which is one of the big jobs we have for them, right? They're for our queen rearing. We can use them to fill our apidays or our mating nukes, mating hives, right? Without having an impact on our crop. And we use them to make up nukes. When we've our queens mated, we take them over apidays or our mating nukes, and we make up nukes that we're going to overwinter, and we're either going to use for ourselves to boost colonies to replace ones where the queens have died or drawn layers over the winter, or for sale the following spring. So we get a reasonable amount of income from sale of nukes every year. So we used our bees for that as well. And word of caution on this, it's all well and good having the big population, but don't forget Hooper's 5 questions. The 5th one is stores. All right. If you get a bad spell of weather, you're going to have to get out there and make sure that they have enough food. And part of your weekly inspection, you should be checking to make sure that you have at least a week's worth of food for the population that hive has. And bear in mind, your population is twice what's in it when you're doing your inspection. So you got to have the equivalent of 2 to 3 national deep frames if they were full with honey on both sides to keep that colony going for a week. That's got to be there all the time. If they've got no income whatsoever, they're going to need that amount there to give them enough that it's not going to put them back, enough there to feed them, and also enough that they're not going to start eating back brood and emptying out brood cells because they think there's starvation coming. So you got to keep them in there. So if they need to be fed, feed them. And there's no income, right? So if you need to feed them, you take off your supers and you give them 1-to-1 syrup. That's beekeeping 101, as the Americans call it, right? Right. Or you can leave your supers on, and in our case, because we're working with deep boxes, we can put in a couple of frames of ivy stores that we took out to make room in the brood nest in the spring. The ivy stores we take out of the brood nest in the spring, they go back into the honey house in deep boxes wrapped in cling film. They're used for nukes. They're used for feeding colonies when they don't have an income coming into the hive. So they're there for spares. And any of them that are left unused, and there's rarely any of them left unused, by the end of July, we'll pop them into nuclei that we've made up during the summer so that we don't end up feeding them. We tend not to have to buy an awful lot of sugar for feeding because we usually have the granulated stores from the previous winter in brood frames to feed into them, right? So that's that part of the presentation. And if I can, I'll just do another couple of slides. It's on a different topic, but it's slightly related, if that's okay with you, Richard, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just keep going fairly quickly. Okay. So it's only a couple of slides on this, right? So the way we raise our queens from our best performers, right? When we've gone through our notes, we raise queens and we raise drones from the best performing colonies. And we don't raise queens or drones from the ones that don't perform, from our from our less than standard, less than quality colonies, right? So that's straightforward enough. Anyone knows, you know, you can select which ones you're getting the larvae from to produce queens. That's straightforward enough. But how do you not raise drones from the ones that are poor quality, right? Now, you either get this concept or you don't. You just got to think about it a little bit, maybe, okay? So we select the colonies, their best colonies for producing queens and our best colonies for producing drones. And we bring the drones from unrelated colonies not related to the ones we're getting the queens from, to the mating apiary and the apiaries we have surrounding it. Okay, so we're not inbreeding. Okay, but we actually raise. No, let me go on. Don't want to confuse it. So the answer, the way we do this, the way we don't raise drones from our poor colonies is, well, the first thing we do is we uncap any drone brood that they make themselves. All right. And we set up drone factories. So these are the selected colonies that we want to raise the male genetics from for our next generation of queens to mate with. Right. So we set up drone factories and their particular job is to make drones. Right. So the premise, and there's research done on this. There's people with the name et al. At the end of them that have done research on this. And their findings back in the 50s and 60s was that the presence of adult drones, of a population of adult drones within a colony, will reduce the urge of that colony to raise more drones. If there's no drones in the colony, they'll readily raise drones so long as there's income coming in. But if there's already a fair amount of drones within the box, they're not going to keep raising drones. Okay, so based on that principle, what we do is we get our best performing colonies to produce the eggs and the larvae for the drones we need. So we have selected colonies we're going to produce drones from. We let that colony lay the eggs, develop the larvae for those drones. So they feed that larvae up until the cells are sealed. And we have frames of drone foundation going into colonies specifically for this purpose, right? Lots and lots of them. Just as a, by the way, all of our supers use drone foundation as well. There's less wax involved, less wax to be built. The cells are bigger and they extract quicker. And you get more honey per frame with drones. Now it's only minuscule the difference. It's more honey per frame with drone comb than there is with worker. And it's easier to get it emptied. So back to where we were. We take our selective drone rearing colony and we let them develop the drone brood up until the time it's sealed, right? Once it's sealed, we take it out of the box and we put it into our, we don't let the high performing colony hatch out those drones. We put them into the colonies that we don't want any drones from. We let them hatch them, right? If they try to raise their own, we uncap it and we put in frames of drone brood for them to hatch out from the best performing colonies. So the poor colonies end up becoming maternity wards, right? And birthing suites for the drones, okay? Our top production colony, our top quality colonies are either raising queens and the unrelated ones to them are raising the drones. So the poor colonies that are not up to scratch with us, we're forcing them to hatch out top quality drones from other colonies, right? Right, so the genetics from the drones are only coming from our selected colonies, right? But the poor colonies are hatching them out. So remember that premise up there at the top? The colony that did produce the drones, produced the genetics for the drones, didn't hatch them out. So there's not that many drones, if any, in that colony. So when we take out the frame of sealed drone brood and pop in another one, there's no hindrance on them then for raising another frame of drone brood. And we'll get 5-6 cycles of drone brood out of our top drone production colonies every year, and every one of those frames will be full timber to timber all the way around both sides, right? Because they don't have any drones in there to tell them you don't really need this much. All right, so they become the good quality colonies are producing the genetics, and the poorer ones are hatching them out. And we can spread those drone colonies, those drone frames for hatching through all the colonies in the apiary. Nukes we find tend not to raise their own drone brood, but if you give them a frame of drone brood that's ready to emerge within a week or so, they'll hatch it out, so long as there's a decent population in it. So if we're moving nukes into our mating apiaries, or we're moving them from apiary to apiary, we'll stick a frame of drone, ready to emerge drone brood in with that, and it'll bring the genetics out to spread it into another apiary as well. Okay. So we're still using our worst performing colonies as part of our production, but they're only really a maternity ward for hatching out the drones. There were the extra few slides. So we give the best performing colonies frames of drone foundation or drone comb at the edge of the brood nest. When they have it laid up and the drone brood is sealed, we remove the frame, give them another empty drone comb frame, and we give the frame of sealed drone brood to the worst performing colonies to hatch it out. All right. It's low maintenance on the recipient colony. They've only got to keep it warm until it hatches, and it prevents them from raising their own. Why would they raise drones when you're after giving them 4,000 hatching drones on a frame? So there's no need to raise their own. So, okay. So when it's finished, if they do try to raise their own, we uncap it. We'll have marked the top of the frame with the colony it came out of, so we know where the genetics are going. And any drones on any frame where we didn't introduce it on the poor colonies, we cut it out or we uncap it. There's an uncapping fork. So when the frame of drone brood is hatched, we can swap it out for another one. All right. And that premise we had earlier on, where the presence of adult drones stops them raising their own drones, doesn't stop them hatching it, just stops them raising new drone brood. If the brood is there, they have stores and they have a population to keep it warm, they will hatch it. So we feed those colonies that are hatching out the drone brood as well. That's the talk. I just thought I'd throw the other bits in because I did mention drones, and the earlier slides didn't really mention how we were producing them and how we were getting the benefit of them. So that's my talk. Pass it back to you now to go through your chat. Hopefully there's a few questions. And
that's excellent, Colm, and that makes perfect sense. If producing drones is it takes so much effort and energy from the colonies, why would they produce their own when you've given them some? So yeah, that makes perfect sense. And that was one of my questions. You said that you don't allow them to raise queens or drones themselves for those poor colonies, but how do you stop them raising drones? So that's answered that one. A few questions in the chat, if you don't mind. First one from John says, 24 frames in your two boxes. Are you using Hoffman?
Yes, absolutely, yeah. Hoffman spacing on all the frames, yeah. Manley's in the shallow supers, but Hoffman's on everything, yeah. Absolutely, yeah. I know there's a lot of the UK-based beekeepers will use I don't know what the DN number is on, the ones where they're just a top bar and you use castellations or spacers or whatever. Doesn't tend to happen in Ireland. We tend to use Hoffman spacing on brood frames here. Don't know why, but that's just the way it's always been.
Super. Greg says that he understands what you're saying about adding new drawn comb from the previous year, but how do you start when you only have foundation place?
Okay, so if we go back to that picture I showed you where they were working the oilseed rape in 2016, we're using deep boxes as supers. So they're drawing the deep comb. Where we're getting the drawn comb is from the super boxes each year. So
actually producing that drone comb starts the year before.
Yeah.
On the oilseed rape and get them
on the oilseed rape, yeah.
Yeah.
Now you'll find it very hard to get them to draw drone comb in a hive with a low population, or especially in a nuke. But if you have a very strong colony and you feed them, they will draw drone comb. But we get it from putting those frames of drone foundation into supers on our strongest colonies the previous year for a honey harvest. We extract them, separate them out then in the honey house after they've been extracted, and they're ready then to go into the drone production colonies the following year. So deep supers is where we get them.
Yeah. Mark says, when old frames are moved to the upper box and filled with honey for extraction, is there a risk of residue from Varroa treatments within the extracted honey?
There would be if I was treating for Varroa, but there isn't in our case.
So if people are wanting to try this method but are currently treating for Varroa, then that is something that they may need to consider.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. You don't want chemical residues in your honey. In fact, I'm assuming you would have the same veterinary medication regulations for yourselves as we have here. You're not allowed put leaf frames on the colony where honey for human consumption is going to be taken from if you're treating with the hard chemicals for Varroa.
Yeah. Michael wants to know what happens to the drones that may be hatching above the queen excluder. So I think he's talking about when you take those sealed frames out of the bottom brood box and put them into the center of the top brood box, and they may have 1 or 2 cells of drone around the edge. Yeah. What happens to those?
Yeah, now in fairness, that we do run into a bit of a problem with that. And usually what we do with those is when we take off when we take off the upper boxes to do our inspection, if there have been an amount of drones hatching in those, we will find sometimes a lot of drones have tried to get through the excluder and have got caught and killed in it, I suppose. But usually what we will do if there's a lot of drone comb on them is that the next time we do the inspection, we'll shake off the bees off the frames in the upper box. The drones will tend to stay on the brood frames rather than go up into the shallow supers, and they'll try to get down towards the lower part to get out. And we just shake those frames down after we take off the excluder. But there is a time where you will have a number of dead drones having tried to get down through the wire excluders or whatever that are on them. That's that can be a little bit of a problem. Depends on the number of them, but we tend to raise most of our drones in colonies that are specifically for that. So it's not but by swapping around the frames like that, we don't get a huge amount of drones. About 15%, they say, in a normal colony. 15% of your brood comb would be drones, say. But if it's a problem and they're upstairs, we shake them down. When we have the excluder off doing the inspection, we shake them down. We could put a little hole, a little 10mm hole or whatever in the front of the brood box, but we just don't bother to get them out. You know, like the one you'd have on the side of the pollen traps. There's a small little circular hole to the side of the fair weather pollen traps for letting the drones out. We could do a little drill hole like that in the front of the boxes, but I've never really bothered with them. I just shake them down when there's a quantity of them there.
I suppose another nice plus to giving colonies frames of drone brood is that when they are drawing out new combs, they're not having to stick drone in the corners because they've already got enough drones in the colony as well. So that reduces that.
Yeah.
Greg says, do you include bees when you are transferring brood frames into your production colonies?
No. No.
Just the frames of seal brood?
The frames of seal brood. No, I give it a light shake or a light brush. If you're brushing them, turn the frame upside down when you're brushing, especially if there's any open cells on it. That way you'll get less bees' legs getting torn off as you're doing your brushing. So we'd lift the frame up, turn it on its back with the lugs facing downwards, give it a light brush on both sides. The bees will fall off it, and then move it into a box then to put onto the next colony. So the brushing upside down is to stop the bees. You're brushing away from the opening of the cells, so you'll get less bits of bees getting stuck in cells while you're brushing. If you're brushing from top to bottom, you'll tend to end up with a lot of bees getting damaged with legs torn off them and things like that. So turning the frame upside down and brushing from the bottom of the frame towards the top, if you know what I mean, you'll end up with the bees get less annoyed with it, and you get less of them damaged. No, we take the bees off the frames when we're transferring them.
I think you came round in your talk to answering this question after it was asked, but Elaine says, what overwintering configuration do you use, and do you leave honey or feed sugar syrup to the bees?
I feed very little sugar in a reasonable year. All right, the only ones really I would be feeding would be nukes that I made up late in the season where they didn't bring enough of their own in, and we didn't have any ivy honey or part frames of heather honey left to winter feed. I try to get the bees to collect their own. It's cheaper on me because I'm not buying the sugar, and it's better for the bees because they'll overwinter better on honey than they will on sugar syrup. And a lot of the colonies we bring to the heather, we will have frames on those where the reason that they're on them is to get winter stores for nukes or for other colonies that we have elsewhere. We don't harvest all of the heather honey that we collect. We don't get the heather honey every year, but even when we do get it, we don't harvest it all. Some of it, those colonies are getting there to collect winter feed for themselves and for nuclei that we have back in the other apiaries. So again, we try to overwinter them on what they collect themselves rather than sugar.
And again, using a brood box as a super means that you've got combs there that have got food that can be dropped into colonies that need feeding.
And they're deep, and you're putting 5 or 6 pounds of stores in with each frame.
Mark wants to know, where on earth does he sell that much honey? With all the honey that they're collecting, there's
no problem selling honey. It's having enough in the bad years is the problem. We got an extra 1/4 of a ton of honey this year because of the season that was in it. A little bit over 1/4 of a ton. That's of the run honey now, not counting heather or ivy, which we haven't processed yet. So it's a particularly good year, and it's there. It will keep. We still have some honey from 2020 in our in the honey house that we haven't got into yet. So it'll sell eventually, so long as it's sealed properly and it's down to the right moisture content before you extract it. The honey will last in an airtight container. It will last for years, and it's not really a problem. It'll sell eventually.
So a couple of people have asked, because you're raising these big colonies up and you're putting in frames of sealed brood, do you have what you perceive to be a bigger problem with Varroa, and how do you sort that out if you do think that you've got Varroa problems?
Okay, in the early part of the year, we put in a frame of drone foundation, or the bottom half of the frame is drone foundation, into each of the colonies. Once that is sealed, we cut out that drone foundation. And sorry, let me just get a drink here. Hold on. So we use that to get rid of a lot of the Varroa population that's in the colonies, and that's our main Varroa management treatment. When we go through our colonies at each inspection, we'll make a note if we see Varroa on bees or we see evidence of Varroa, deformed wing, that kind of stuff. And those colonies, we will have those earmarked for treatment with oxalic acid in the winter between December and January. But that's the only treatment that we do for Varroa. We're not putting on ApiGuard, we're not putting on strips, that kind of stuff, right? We do a 1 drone brood cull in the springtime, and if there's evidence of deformed wing, we're not going to be raising queens from those. The evidence of chalk brood, we wouldn't raise queens from it either. And any of them that have evidence of deformed wing, we'll earmark them for giving a sublimation treatment with oxalic acid in December or January, and that keeps them the population of Varroa down.
And because you're treating at that point, there's no sealed brood, so you get in that. Brood, no. You get in those.
You get them, the ones that are out in the bees.
Yeah.
The phoretic stage or whatever they call it, something like
that.
Yeah.
Tony wants to know, when you first introduce the extra frames of sealed brood to colonies, are you not risking chilled brood?
No, I'm only introducing them when they're already on 14 or so frames of their own brood. So the population is already up there. It only takes, if you've open brood, a frame of open brood requires 1,500 bees to keep it warm. If you have a good population of bees in the colony, right, where we would have those because we've got 14, 16 frames of brood in the boxes anyway, they're well able to handle another 2 frames of sealed brood. It doesn't take 1,500 bees for every frame to keep it warm, because when you put them all together they can cluster around the outside. You don't need as many bees in the inside. So we'd only put them in when the population that's in the box, in the colony, is sufficient to look after the extra brood that we're giving in. We don't boost them like that in the springtime. What we do is, In the spring, if we have a weaker colony, it's healthy, just has a low population, and it needs a boost of brood. We can go to a colony that's very strong and again is healthy and has a frame of seal brood. We find the queen in that colony, put her to one side, put her into a little queen trap temporarily, and then we'll take a frame of advanced brood along with whatever bees are on it, and we'll put that into an envelope made out of newspaper, and we'll use that to transfer brood and attending bees into the weaker colony. If you look up Dave Cushman's website, which your own Roger Patterson looks after, you'll find the details of how to make that and a template for making it in there. And it's a handy way of moving a frame of seal brood from a strong colony, strong healthy colony, into a weaker colony in the spring or the early part of the year without the weaker colony not having enough bees to look after it. So you can transfer them across. It's a bit like the way you unite two boxes with a sheet of newspaper between, but you're only bringing in an extra frame of advanced brood with the adhering bees on it. But they're not going to fight because by the time, someone's put up the link there.
Me. Sorry,
the newspaper bag or the newspaper envelopes, we call them. In the winter time, we make up 20 or 30 of those around an oversized dummy board. That's the only reason we use dummy boards is for that particular job. We don't use them in our normal beekeeping at all. And we make up 20 or 30 of those, fold them one inside the other, and they sit in a breakfast cereal box in the back of the van until they're needed in the spring. That's the way we do it. But other than that, no, we only bring in frames of brood into a colony that has enough bees to look after that so that there's not an impact on it. You've got to have that balance at the start. If you put too much brood in, absolutely, the colony will go under pressure and you'll lose brood. Right, but we're doing this in the middle of the summer when the population's already there, and we're boosting a colony that's up around the 50,000 bees already by giving them an extra 8,000 bees. So they're going to have enough bees in there to mind it already. And it's only short term. It's only for a week or so at most.
Mm-hmm. Michael's asking, how do you store your brood frames for next year?
Okay, the brood frames that we take off that have had brood in them already, most of those we will have cut out the brood comb, cleaned down the frames and rendered the wax. Right. All of the other frames that we have, whether they're supers or whether they have had brood in them or whatever before, they go into our honey storage house or honey super storage house, and they're all wrapped in cling film, the stuff that you use on pallet wrap, food grade pallet wrap, and two layers of that around them. We stick a label on the outside of it to indicate what the contents are. So it's National Deep drawn comb, National Deep half drawn, half foundation, National Deep had brood, whatever. We write it on the end of the box so that we don't have to open every box then in the spring when we're looking to load the van to go out to the apiaries. We know what's in, what's drawn comb, what's not drawn, what's drawn comb, what's worker foundation, that kind of stuff. So we store every box is individually wrapped with cling film after they've been extracted, and the propolis has been cleaned off the lugs and off the Hoffman's spacers where they're touching, that kind of stuff. When they're all cleaned down, ready for use, they're shrink wrapped with the pallet wrap, food grade pallet wrap. The boxes are labelled, and then they're stacked. Floor and a queen excluder at the bottom, queen excluder and a roof at the top. And their floors that we put at the bottom have 4 little wheels or 4 casters on them. We tie them down then with a ratchet strap, and it means we can move them around the shed when we need to, without having to, lift and restack every time you want to go looking for something. Makes it a bit easier on us for moving stuff around. So long as you don't build the stack any higher than the doorway that you need to get them out from. It's all right stacking them up to the ceiling, but if you've got to take off the ratchet strap and unstack half them in order to get them out to the yard to load the van, that's not really helpful. You've lost the benefit of the wheels at that stage. So make sure they'll fit out the door on the wheels, on the casters. That's the way we do them.
Chris wants to know, what is your spacing for drone frames? Is that just
it's all Hoffman spacing that we have, so it's predetermined.
Yeah.
It's in the frames. We're not using I don't know what you call those other frames, DN somethings, I don't know. They're all Hoffman spaced, self-spacing frames that we're using. So we're not using castellations or the little plastic spacers on our frames.
Yeah. David wants to know if you keep the queen excluder in between the boxes for winter.
No. All queen excluders off for the winter. We don't want them that they'll tend to move up anyway. When we go to our boxes in the spring, there'll be practically nothing in the lower box. There might be a small bit of brood at the top of the frames in the lower box and a bit of brace comb built between them to bridge the gaps. But most of the bees will be in the upper brood box in the spring because it's warmer. So no, queen excluders off for the winter, absolutely.
And Tom says, what are you typically putting on as your third box above the queen excluder?
Okay, that will depend on the height of the stands. If we have them on in our permanent apiaries, the stands will be about 18 inches high off the ground, about level with the top of my knee, so that when we're working the lower box, my back is dead straight. So I'm not putting any pressure on my back when I'm working. If we're out on a crop, we will have plastic pallets cut to 18 inches deep on the ground, and the beehives will be sitting on those. When we're working the ones on the field, on the plastic pallets on the ground, we have a little camping stool, one at the back, one at the side while we're working our colonies, and we're sitting down working the colony. So again, no pressure on the back. In those cases, I could have 2 deep super sitting on top of that second brood box until it gets to kind of the height of my shoulders, and after that, then you're putting shallow boxes on to make it easier to lift off. It's no joke lifting a heavy box above your shoulder height or above mid chest height probably. So if they're on the high stands, we'll tend to have a max of 3 deeps and the rest are shallows then. And ideally national shallows up high where you can get a decent grip on the box for lifting it on and off. We've 2 of us working the colonies together at all times, so it's a little bit easier to lift the boxes down when you've one person each side of it. But yeah, it depends on whether they're on a stand 18 inches high or one that's 4 inches up off the ground.
A couple more questions. John says, for the first time this year, he gave his bees drone foundation, and the result were lots of drones, but also every colony treated in that way was much calmer.
Yeah, they need the balance within the colony. Now, I'm not scientific on this, but the books and the researchers will tell you that in the wild, when you look at a colony that's living in a cavity in a tree or in the roof of a house or whatever, about 15 to 17% of the comb is drone. What Tom Seeley in his democracy book and in the books about bee hunting and stuff like that, looking for the colonies in the wild, and that from his stuff, he's coming up with the same figures, 15 to 17%. So it's needed there. And the idea, like some of the very old books from the early part of the 20th century, cut out the drones, you don't want any of them, they're eating all the honey. You need them in there. You don't get a colony, you don't get the balance in temperament unless there's a certain amount of drones there. You could call it, when I started off beekeeping, they used to call it having the man around the house. Right, to put up with them, but it's needed to keep the balance in the colony, to keep them calm, to keep them on an even keel. Now, in the cooler evenings and that kind of stuff, some of the drones are there and they're consuming food, and as they metabolize the food and they exercise their wing muscles or whatever, they're warming up the colony as well. So maybe they're putting a contribution towards keeping the heat in the colony as well. So having the drones there in the colony and letting them raise drones will put more balance into it. It makes sense. Absolutely. So let them do it. Putting a frame of drone foundation at the front or the back of the brood nest makes an awful lot of sense.
Final question for you then, and then we'll let you get off for the evening.
Yeah, there's no problem anymore.
Chris says, how old are your queens that go to the heather?
Most of my queens would be less than 3 full seasons old. A lot of them would be either in their first full season. So this year's what I call first season for 2022 would have been ones that hatched in 2021. So they'll be in their first or their second full season. If they're going over that and their quality, I will have moved them back into nukes in order to reduce the amount of brood they're rearing, so that I'll get an extra year or 2 out of them for raising daughter queens from. So the first or second year. The key thing, I think, is rather than the age of the queen, because the population you're looking for when you bring them to the heather, that population should already be in the colony. You shouldn't be bringing them to the heather to raise bees to collect heather. That they should already be in there. And you need the big population. My father back in the day would say that you brought your bees to the heather to kill them. Because when you brought them there, the population was halved by the time they collected the heather, because all the foraging bees were worked to death by the time the crop was collected. So you need a big population before you go to the heather, and the heather will sort it out and bring it back down to winter population size for you. So it doesn't particularly matter. It's the population in the box on the day you bring it to the heather is going to determine what crop you're going to get. Obviously the weather as well, but if all things being equal, you need a very strong colony going to the heather. If that makes sense.
It certainly does. Colm, we are most grateful for your time this evening. It was a very interesting talk. Lots of takeaways for people to consider, and alternative ways of managing bees. So we are most grateful. I will put the recording up in a couple of weeks' time when we've got it sorted.
Yep.
But for this evening, Colm, thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you very much, and thanks for everyone who attended. It's good to get a good crowd in and a good set of questions. So again, thanks very much, and hopefully we'll see you all in line or in person maybe at some future event.